was a crisp spring morning in Concord, New Hampshire, when news broke that a shocking arrest had finally unraveled the mystery surrounding the disappearance of 14-year-old Isabelle Carter. The town, small and tightly knit, had long been haunted by the memory of Isabelle, who vanished one rainy afternoon in September 2004 while walking home from school. For nearly 2 decades, her disappearance had left the community in a state of quiet unease, whispers and rumors filling in gaps that official investigation could not. Parents remained vigilant, children were never allowed to wander alone, and the shadow of uncertainty hung over everyday life. Yet no one could have anticipated that after 18 years, the case would resurface with such a dramatic twist. Detective Alex Monroe, now a veteran investigator, had followed Isabelle's case since her disappearance. At the time, he had been a young officer, inundated with the frustration of dead ends and elusive leads. The original investigation had focused on neighborhood searches, questioning local residents and following up on tips, but the trail had long since gone cold. Isabelle's backpack, found abandoned near a creek, had yielded little in terms of forensic evidence. Witnesses remembered seeing her on the street, umbrellas bouncing in the rain, chatting with friends before she disappeared into the mist of an overcast afternoon. Despite the absence of concrete leads, Detective Monroe never stopped thinking about the case. He often revisited old files, sometimes late at night, piecing together details that seemed insignificant at first glance but nagged at his instincts. In 2022, the Cold Case Unit decided to re-examine unsolved disappearances from the early 2000s, using modern forensic methods and behavioral analysis. The team, comprising detectives, forensic experts, and psychologists, approached Isabelle's case with renewed vigor. Every piece of evidence was meticulously reviewed. The abandoned backpack was reanalyzed using advanced DNA techniques unavailable at the time, and investigators re-interviewed witnesses, applying knowledge about human memory and perception to detect inconsistencies or overlooked details. Experts in human behavior noted that suspects often exhibit subtle patterns of concealment and manipulation over time, patterns that could be revealed through careful psychological analysis and investigative persistence. A breakthrough emerged when the DNA extracted from the backpack was compared with national databases. The results were definitive. This was the moment Detective Monroe had anticipated for years. The DNA matched a man who had lived in the community at the time of Isabelle's disappearance, but had long since relocated to a neighboring state. This man, now identified as 38-year-old Victor Langley, had maintained a low profile, working various jobs and raising a family, and had never been suspected in any serious crime. The revelation shocked the town. Someone who had appeared ordinary, even unremarkable, had been hiding a dark secret for nearly 2 decades. Law enforcement moved cautiously but decisively. Detective Monroe coordinated with federal authorities, local police, and forensic teams to plan Langley's arrest. The goal was to ensure public safety, preserve the integrity of evidence, and prevent any possibility of Langley fleeing or destroying critical material. The psychological element of the case was critical at this stage. Behavioral experts advised law enforcement on anticipating Langley's potential reactions, his possible attempts to manipulate interrogators, his likely denial strategies, and the subtle cues that could betray his involvement. Officers were trained to maintain control, respond calmly to attempts at deflection, and recognize micro-expressions and inconsistencies that could confirm suspicions. The day of the arrest arrived quietly, almost incongruously, given the magnitude of the revelation. Langley was apprehended without incident at his residence. Initially, he appeared composed, almost unnervingly calm, but trained investigators noticed the minute tension in his shoulders, the flicker of unease in his eyes. During initial questioning, Langley provided vague, evasive answers, attempting to downplay any connection to Isabelle's disappearance. Detectives, however, had anticipated these tactics. They presented the DNA evidence, eyewitness statements, and psychological profiles that painted a compelling picture of his involvement. Each confrontation chipped away at his carefully constructed facade, revealing cracks in the story that could not be ignored. News of Langley's arrest spread through Concord like wildfire. Residents, many of whom had grown up alongside Isabelle or her parents, were stunned. For years, they had clung to the hope that their town was safe, that the unknown perpetrator would be caught. Yet the revelation forced them to confront the reality that someone among them had concealed a horrific secret for nearly 2 decades. Community meetings were held, where families discussed safety, the long-term psychological effects of unresolved trauma, and the collective shock that accompanies the sudden surfacing of hidden truths. Local psychologists emphasized that such events can trigger a resurgence of grief, anxiety, and suspicion, particularly in close-knit communities where familiarity had once bred a false sense of security. Meanwhile, the Moreno family, who had been engaged with cold cases in their own community, observed the unfolding events with empathy and shared understanding. They had endured similar trauma, living with unanswered questions and long-held uncertainty. The parallels between the cases highlighted common psychological threads: the enduring pain of waiting, the complex interplay between hope and despair, and the profound impact on families and communities when truth is delayed. For the Carters, the mere act of seeing justice being served reignited hope, while also stirring memories of their own struggles too. Find closure, the investigative team meticulously prepared the case for prosecution, aware that the psychological dimension of both the suspect and the victims, families would play a critical role in courtroom proceedings. Behavioral psychologists worked alongside detectives to document Langley's patterns, highlighting indicators of manipulation, calculated concealment, and cognitive dissonance that characterized his actions. They noted that long-term offenders often cultivate a facade of normalcy, integrating into communities in ways that obscure their true behaviors and intentions. Presenting these insights in court would not only contextualize the crime, but also demonstrate the deliberate, premeditated nature of Langley's conduct. As the evidence accumulated, the community began grappling with a mix of relief and disbelief. The long-dormant case had reopened old wounds, yet it also provided an avenue for closure. Residents reflected on the broader implications of the arrest, recognizing the importance of vigilance, community engagement, and the integration of psychological insight into law enforcement practices. Schools and local organizations initiated programs aimed at educating children and parents about safety, intuition, and awareness, using Isabelle's story as a compelling example. These initiatives underscored the human psychology behind preventive measures, emphasizing the role of perception, social cues, and situational awareness in personal security. Detective Monroe and his team continued their methodical work, reconstructing Isabelle's last known movements, mapping interactions, and creating a timeline that could withstand scrutiny in court. Interviews with long-forgotten witnesses revealed details previously overlooked, including subtle behavioral cues from Langley at the time that now seemed ominously significant. Experts in human behavior provided context, explaining how perpetrators often leave faint traces of their presence through minor inconsistencies or subtle psychological manipulation that are only discernible through careful, expert analysis years later. By the end of Part 1, the stage was set for a high-stakes legal and psychological confrontation. Victor Langley's arrest had not only reopened an 18-year-old cold case, but also exposed deep-seated community anxieties, the enduring impact of unresolved trauma, and the remarkable persistence of investigators dedicated to the pursuit of truth. The narrative of Isabelle Carter was no longer one of uncertainty and fear. It had transformed into a story of relentless investigation, the application of human psychological insight, and the eventual unraveling of hidden truths. The case served as a reminder that even after decades, the combination of modern forensic science, expert psychological analysis, and unwavering investigative diligence could illuminate the darkest corners of unresolved crime. For Isabelle's family and the Concord community, hope had been reignited, tempered with the sobering knowledge of the psychological scars left by long-term concealment, yet bolstered by the knowledge that justice, no matter how delayed, had finally begun to unfold. The day following Victor Langley's arrest, the town of Concord was in a state of quiet shock. People went about their routines, yet conversations carried an undercurrent of disbelief. Parents walked their children to school a little more slowly. Neighbors glanced at one another with cautious curiosity, and old friends speculated in hushed tones about how a man they had known for years could hide such a terrible secret. The Carters, Isabelle's parents, were overwhelmed by a mix of relief, sorrow, and anger. 18 years of unanswered questions had left emotional scars that now threatened to resurface in unexpected ways. Yet, for the first time, they felt that the truth might finally provide some semblance of closure. Detective Alex Monroe, aware that the legal process would be painstaking, continued to examine Langley's background with forensic precision. Every aspect of his life, from old employment records to social interactions, was scrutinized. Investigators sought to understand the psychology behind Langley's actions, looking for patterns that might indicate motive, premeditation, or potential accomplices. Behavioral psychologists highlighted a crucial point. Perpetrators who evade capture for years often construct intricate mental narratives to justify their crimes, maintaining a facade of normalcy that even close acquaintances fail to detect. Understanding these mental patterns was key not only for building the case, but also for anticipating Langley's potential courtroom strategies. Langley, during interrogation, oscillated between composed denial and subtle signs of anxiety. Detectives noted the micro-expressions, fleeting smirks that betrayed a fleeting acknowledgement of guilt, a slight clenching of fists when confronted with evidence, and momentary avoidance of eye contact when questioned about Isabelle's last known whereabouts. These behaviors were meticulously documented as they provided crucial insight into Langley's mental state. Psychologists advise that long-term, offenders often rely on cognitive deflection, creating mental justifications for their actions and attempting to manipulate investigators' perceptions, so careful observation of inconsistencies was essential. Meanwhile, the town itself struggled with a wave of collective psychological stress. People revisited memories of that fateful day in 2004, reinterpreting seemingly minor events through the lens of newfound understanding. Teachers recalled moments when Isabelle had been unusually quiet or distracted in class. Neighbors remembered Langley's presence near areas where she had been last seen, and parents shared feelings of vulnerability that they had buried for nearly 2 decades. Experts emphasized that such delayed recognition of threats is a common human response, a cognitive mechanism that initially suppresses anxiety, but later resurfaces with greater intensity once patterns become clear. In the midst of the unfolding legal preparation, Detective Monroe and his team uncovered more subtle evidence that had been overlooked at the time of Isabelle's disappearance. Old photographs, now re-examined with modern image enhancement techniques, revealed Langley in proximity to areas Isabelle had frequented. Small details, like the positioning of objects in his yard or slight inconsistencies in neighborly accounts, now assumed new significance. These findings, when combined with the DNA evidence, created a compelling narrative of premeditated concealment. Behavioral specialists noted that offenders often leave a trail of minor, seemingly innocuous actions that accumulate into a pattern of culpability, pattern only visible through sustained, detailed investigation. Langley's psychological profile became a central focus in preparing for trial. Experts studied his past interactions, relationships, and social behaviors, identifying characteristics typical of someone capable of long-term deception, charm used to deflect suspicion, meticulous attention to routine to avoid detection, and a subtle tendency to isolate victims psychologically. They also explored his potential trigger situations that might cause him to reveal the truth inadvertently and trained investigators to exploit these moments during interviews. This approach was designed to elicit authentic reactions rather than relying solely on coercive questioning. As the prosecution's case began to take shape, it became clear that this trial would be about more than evidence. It would be a study in human psychology, perception, and the delayed impact of trauma. Witnesses were re-interviewed with guidance from psychologists, ensuring that their recollections were framed accurately and that the influence of memory decay was mitigated. Memory, experts explained, is reconstructive, and after many years, witnesses may unintentionally fill gaps with assumptions or distorted recollections. Properly managed, these accounts could still provide powerful testimony without compromising credibility. The town, meanwhile, experienced a ripple effect of renewed vigilance. Local organizations held seminars on safety, emphasizing how subtle behavioral cues can be early indicators of danger. Parents learned about situational awareness, intuition, and the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong. Schools integrated lessons on psychological resilience and recognizing manipulation, reinforcing the idea that understanding human behavior is critical not only for preventing future tragedies but also for processing past trauma. Isabelle's story became a somber yet instructive case study for the entire community, highlighting how ordinary environments can conceal extraordinary danger. As trial preparations continued, Langley's demeanor shifted subtly. At first, he maintained a composed exterior, but over time, small behaviors revealed cracks in his psychological defenses. Detectives observed subtle tics, brief hesitations in speech, rapid blinking when discussing timelines, and slight shifts in posture when questioned about locations he had frequented. Psychologists identified these as classic indicators of stress and deception. Long-term offenders often struggle to maintain fabricated narratives under sustained scrutiny, and these provided investigators with additional validation of Langley's involvement. The prosecution also incorporated an analysis of Langley's interactions with community members over the years, highlighting his careful cultivation of trust and normalcy. This approach aimed to show the jury that his apparent ordinariness was not evidence of innocence, but a calculated tool for evasion. Experts explained that offenders frequently blend into social environments, using predictable routines to avoid suspicion, while simultaneously hiding behaviors that only emerge upon detailed, focused analysis. The goal was to demonstrate both the deliberate nature of the crime and the psychological sophistication involved in maintaining secrecy for nearly 2 decades. For Isabelle's parents, the process was emotionally taxing. Each piece of evidence, every psychological assessment, brought a mix of hope and renewed grief. They were acutely aware that justice would not erase the lost years, the birthdays missed, or the memories they would never share. Yet, the meticulous presentation of evidence and the careful integration of behavioral insight provided reassurance that the system was capable of uncovering the truth, even after so much time had passed. The interplay between forensic science and human psychology was now central to their understanding of the case, giving structure to their grief and clarity to their pursuit of justice. As the trial date approached, the media spotlight intensified. Reporters explored every angle, from forensic breakthroughs to psychological analyses, drawing public attention to the complex interplay of evidence, memory, and behavior. The community, while eager for resolution, also expressed concern over the potential re-traumatization of witnesses and families. Mental health professionals provided guidance, emphasizing the need for careful handling of sensitive testimony and the importance of structured support for those directly affected by the proceedings. Detective Monroe and his team, aware of the stakes, continued to refine their approach. Each session with Langley, each review of evidence, was guided by an understanding of human behavior and cognition. The investigators anticipated the defense's likely strategies, preparing counterarguments rooted in both science and observation. They knew that in cases of long-delayed justice, the psychological dimension often carries as much weight as physical evidence, shaping the narrative that would ultimately convince a jury by the end of Part 2. The story had evolved from a simple missing person case into a complex exploration of human behavior, deception, and the resilience of a community. Isabelle Carter's disappearance, long shrouded in uncertainty, had become a catalyst for understanding the subtle, often hidden, mechanisms of manipulation and concealment. The arrest of Victor Langley was no longer merely an act of law enforcement. It represented the culmination of years of psychological insight, investigative perseverance, and the relentless pursuit of truth. The stage was set for the final chapter, where the courtroom would become a battleground of evidence, strategy, and human understanding. Witnesses would confront memories long buried. Forensic evidence would tell stories decades old, and the suspects' psychological defenses would be tested like never before. For the Carters and the town of Concord, the final act promised resolution, confrontation, and the profound, unsettling realization of how deeply hidden truths can shape the course of lives for generations. The courtroom in Concord was packed with anticipation, an almost tangible tension hanging in the air. Nearly 18 years after Isabelle Carter's disappearance, the trial of Victor Langley had begun, and the weight of time pressed heavily on everyone present. Family members, neighbors, and townspeople had returned with a mixture of hope and trepidation, eager to see justice, yet anxious about the reliving of trauma. Isabelle's parents sat at the front, holding hands tightly, their eyes betraying a combination of grief, exhaustion, and cautious optimism. The legal battle ahead would test not only the evidence gathered, but also the human understanding of memory, deception, and accountability. As the prosecution opened its case, the The first images presented were of Isabelle at age 8, smiling in photographs that her family had long preserved. The images were juxtaposed with evidence of Langley's presence near locations she had frequented, each detail meticulously reconstructed with maps, timelines, and digital overlays. Forensic analysts explained how DNA evidence, long dormant, had been preserved and eventually matched to Langley through advances in technology. The courtroom was silent as the narrative unfolded, revealing the painstaking care taken by investigators to connect the dots after nearly 2 decades. Witness after witness recounted their memories, each testimony layered with psychological insight. Teachers described Isabelle as a bright, curious child who had occasionally mentioned encounters with an unfamiliar man near school grounds. Neighbors recalled Langley's presence, often as benign as a man tending to his garden. Yet, in retrospect, subtle behaviors now seemed suspicious. Psychologists helped frame these accounts, explaining to the jury how memory, while imperfect, could retain essential truth when guided carefully. They highlighted the reconstructive nature of memory, showing how details that seemed minor at the time could gain significance in the context of a broader investigation. Langley's defense team attempted to undermine the credibility of long-dormant evidence, arguing that memories had faded and that DNA evidence could be contaminated. However, the prosecution countered with precise documentation of the chain of custody and expert testimony on modern forensic techniques. Behavioral psychologists were called to the stand, explaining the micro-expressions and subtle behavioral cues that investigators had observed during interrogations, and how these provided independent corroboration of Langley's involvement. The courtroom, often tense and quiet, seemed to collectively grasp the depth of human psychology at play, how deception, manipulation, and memory interwove over decades. During cross-examination, Langley's composure began to crack. Observers noted fleeting gestures, a hand trembling ever so slightly, a shift in posture when asked to recall the final day Isabelle had been seen, and a brief, almost imperceptible narrowing of the eyes. The prosecution emphasized these cues, arguing that long-term evasion required constant mental strain, which inevitably produced detectable signs of guilt. Experts explained to the jury that offenders often construct complex rationalizations to maintain their innocence in their own minds, but sustained scrutiny tends to unravel these constructs, revealing inconsistencies and behavioral markers that support the truth. Outside the courtroom, the town of Concord experienced a mixture of catharsis and unease. Media coverage highlighted not only the evidence, but also the psychological insights being presented, sparking community discussions about awareness, trust, and the subtle dynamics that allow predators to operate unnoticed. Local schools organized sessions on recognizing manipulation and understanding behavior, emphasizing that knowledge of human psychology was a key tool in preventing future tragedies. Parents spoke openly about heightened vigilance, and townspeople reflected on the long shadow cast by Isabelle's disappearance, realizing that the pursuit of justice was intertwined with a collective journey of understanding and resilience. Back in the courtroom, the prosecution gradually unveiled the timeline that had long eluded resolution. Small pieces of evidence, overlooked receipts, faded photographs, and witness observations were pieced together to form a coherent narrative of Langley's movements and opportunities. Behavioral patterns were highlighted, illustrating the meticulous planning and manipulative strategies Langley had employed. Psychologists explained that offenders often rely on environmental control and manipulation of perception, creating an illusion of normalcy while concealing malicious intent. This explanation gave the jury insight into the deliberate nature of Langley's concealment and the sophistication of his deception. The emotional intensity increased when Isabelle's parents were called to testify. Their voices trembled, but they spoke with courage, recounting the years of uncertainty, grief, and quiet hope. Each memory was a testament to resilience, and their accounts reinforced the human dimension of the case. The jury listened closely as they described not just the absence of their daughter, but the psychological impact of unanswered questions on every aspect of their lives. Experts interjected gently, framing these experiences in terms of trauma psychology, showing how prolonged ambiguity can produce lasting effects on memory, emotion, and perception, and why closure even decades later was essential for healing. Langley's defense sought to portray him as an ordinary member of the community, someone unfairly accused after years had passed. Yet the prosecution meticulously dismantled these claims, linking behavioral evidence to concrete facts. Micro-expressions, patterns of avoidance, and small inconsistencies in previous statements were combined with the DNA evidence, photographs, and witness recollections to form an overwhelmingly coherent case. Psychologists explained that long-term offenders often use the strategy of blending into society, relying on predictability and routine to avoid suspicion, but that these very strategies leave traceable patterns that can be identified when approached with expertise in human behavior. As the trial reached its climax, the jury deliberated on not just the factual evidence, but also the psychological narrative woven throughout the case. The integration of human behavior, forensic science, and meticulous investigation created a multi-dimensional understanding of the events, making it clear how Langley had managed to evade detection for nearly 2 decades. For the first time, the town, the family, and even the wider community could see a path toward resolution, one grounded not merely in law but in insight into human nature and the mechanisms of long-term deception. The verdict, when announced, brought a collective exhale of relief and affirmation. Guilty Langley's sentence was significant, reflecting both the severity of his crime and the extraordinary efforts required to uncover the truth. Isabelle's parents, holding each other tightly, felt the culmination of years of waiting, grief, and anxiety transform into a fragile sense of closure. The courtroom, filled with jurors, media, and community members, acknowledged not only the legal resolution but also the intricate tapestry of psychology, memory, and investigation that had made justice possible. In the aftermath, the Carters sought to transform their grief into advocacy, speaking publicly about the importance of awareness, vigilance, and understanding human behavior. Schools integrated lessons on manipulation, behavioral cues, and safety, while community centers held workshops for parents and children alike. The town of Concord, once shadowed by uncertainty and fear, began to heal, guided by both the legal outcome and the psychological insights that had illuminated the case. Isabelle's story, tragic as it was, became a source of education and empowerment, highlighting how careful observation, persistence, and understanding human psychology can bring justice. Even after years of darkness, Victor Langley's incarceration marked not just the end of a legal process, but also the culmination of an extraordinary intersection of science, psychology, and relentless human determination. For the investigators, the case was a reminder that even when time obscures truth, patterns of behavior, memory, and psychological evidence can illuminate the path forward. For the community, It was a testament to resilience and the capacity to confront painful realities while nurturing hope and understanding. Years later, Isabelle's story continued to resonate, serving as a study in human behavior, community vigilance, and the enduring power of justice. Parents reflected on the subtle cues they might have missed. Neighbors reconsidered the significance of ordinary seeming behavior, and children were educated on how to understand and protect themselves from manipulation. The case left an indelible mark on Concord, demonstrating that knowledge of human psychology is not merely academic, it is a practical tool for safeguarding communities and fostering resilience in the face of long-delayed justice. The resolution of the New Hampshire 2004 cold case was a victory not only for law enforcement and Isabelle's family, but also for the broader understanding of how human behavior, memory, and perception interact over time. It highlighted the extraordinary lengths to which investigators must go to uncover truth, and how the integration of psychological expertise with forensic and testimonial evidence can bring clarity where once there was only ambiguity. In the end, the town of Concord learned that while evil can remain hidden, it can never escape the light of persistent, informed, and humanly empathetic pursuit. By the time the courtroom emptied and the community began to settle back into routines, the story had taken on a life of its own, a narrative of tragedy, perseverance, and the triumph of careful, human-centered investigation. Isabelle's memory would endure not just in family photographs or the hearts of those who loved her, but in the lessons learned by an entire community about vigilance, resilience, and the profound impact of understanding human psychology in the pursuit of justice.